Hello, chess fans. My number one best chess game of the 2000s is Veselin Topalov versus Levon Aronian from Weichensee 2006. Now, in the 2000s, many great players were vying for the title of champion and the number one spot atop the world rankings. In 2005, Topalov won the FIDE tournament to establish a new champion, and although he lost the reunification match in 2006, that's quite an interesting story there, he did establish himself as the number one rated player in the world for 27 months across the decade. In fact, the only players in history who have been at the top of the ELO list for longer are Garry Kasparov, Anatoly Karpov, Bobby Fischer, and Magnus Carlsen. That's truly elite company indeed. In this game, we see Topalov at his best as he offers multiple exchange sacrifices to establish some great bishops and some great passed pawns and beautifully overwhelm Levon Aronian. Topalov opens up this game with pawn to d4, and Aronian is going to select a Queen's Indian defense in return. In fact, Aronian's going to go for a very solid Queen's Indian as he plays both pawn c6 and then pawn to d5. Now he's going for a setup here where he's saying, I'm going to put my pawns on the light squares, then your bishop will not be very effective. This bishop is already not very effective. If you have two ineffective bishops, I must be doing okay with the black pieces. Of course, Topalov has other ideas. He plays knight e5. We see an exchange of knights. Both players are going to sensibly castle in a moment, and then pawn to e4 from Topalov. Of course, he's trying to break down this light squared blockade in the middle of the board and free his bishops when he can hope to be a lot better. At this point in the game, Aronian goes for b5, committing to an I'm going to put all my pawns on the light squares strategy. After pawn to b5, you do have to watch out for some tactics. For example, e5 and then c5 does not work. Even if it worked, it might not be all that desirable. But pawn to b4 here attacks the rook, attacks the bishop on c3, and wins an exchange. In fact, white could play this exchange sacrifice for pretty good compensation, but it's not what Topalov has in mind. Instead, we see e takes d5, and then the rook goes over to the open e file and gets out of the way of potential attacks from a light squared bishop. Black also might be worried about potential attack from this light squared bishop and would also like open files for rooks. So rook b8, hoping to open the b file, not hoping to move a pawn like a knight. And then pawn c5 saying to the rook, no, you may not have an open file. After c5, this bishop is not so good, so bishop c8, knight f3, headed to e5, but black gets to the amazing knight outpost first with knight e4, attacking the undefended bishop on c3. Now, this is already the critical moment in this game. In fact, this had been played before, and knight e5, not a mouse slip, had been played previously. Unfortunately, knight e5, though a very cool idea, is probably only good for a very small advantage in a drawish position. Now, I say this is not a mouse slip because you're probably going, hey, free piece. I know free stuffs equals good. I should take this, and this can't be good for white. But after knight takes, queen c2, the knight cannot save itself, so you have to do something like queen c7, as was played in Balogun versus Sadvakasov, and white got just a little bit of an advantage maybe after black gave back the knight on c3. If you were greedy and tried to keep that knight after knight takes c3, queen c2, and you played knight to e4, I can take on c6, I can take on b8 after that fork, and I can take here. And sometimes a pair of bishops against two pawns and a rook can be very effective. In this case, the pair of bishops is not the important pair. The important pair is the pair of connected passed pawns. Therefore, white is much better in this position, and you should not do this. However, because of the possibility of black getting just a drawish game after knight e5, we actually see Topalov, who at this point in the decade might have been one of the best prepared players on the planet, especially after Kasparov had resigned a year earlier after losing just before his retirement a critical game to Topalov. In this position, he had prepared rook takes e4. Boom! This is a wonderful, wonderful exchange sacrifice. Many of you may be familiar with the famous exchange sacrifices of Tigran Petrosian, the world champion. Those were often more positional exchange sacrifices, saying, I'm going to control a color complex, or I'm going to establish a blockade. Instead, Topalov's exchange sacrifices are much more about dynamism and freeing the other pieces in the position. For example, both of these bishops seemed kind of sad a moment ago, but you are going to see them absolutely come to life in this game. After rook takes e4, pawn takes, then we see knight to e5, hitting both c6 and e4. There's really not a choice to allow these to fall for black. So we see the only move, queen d5, that defends both of these, and then queen to e1 from Topalov. He is attacking e4, and there's only two ways to defend it. The worst way seems to be pawn to f5. You might be saying, hey, pawn to f5 is the best way to defend it. I know if I want to defend something that's been attacked, I should use a sturdy pawn. But this is going to soften a lot of light squares in the position, and after pawn to f3, you're going to have to either allow white to open the position and get a ton of pressure on your targets, or you're going to have to immediately give one pawn back when white already has more than enough compensation for the exchange. So instead, we see the other way to defend the pawn on e4, that is bishop f5 played in the game. And now we have two interesting choices for Topalov. The more conservative choice is pawn to f3, trying to break down this point here on e4. This is very reasonable and seems to give good compensation. It's not clear to me that either choice is necessarily better than the other, but I do know which choice is more spectacular. That's pawn to g4, as played by Topalov. He first strikes out here, attacking this bishop, and now the bishop is forced back to g6, and then he plays pawn to f3. Now, when you play pawn to g4, you inevitably do open up the white king. That's the major concern. Isn't black going to, at some point, get some counterplay because the white king is more open than he needs to be? I don't play like a computer, neither does Topalov, and neither does anyone else on the planet. So when you play a move like pawn g4, you're making a commitment not just to be able to hold back the opponent's counterplay for a few moves, but for the long term. One slip and your opponent should get enough counterplay. And in fact, we will see a moment later on where Aronian might have had a chance to exploit the extension g4 and get some counterplay, though that might also be a slip from Topalov. In any case, after g4 and f3, the position remains super sharp and interesting. You can never really capture here on f3 because after bishop takes f3, then your queen is hit, and there's actually a skewer picking up the pawn on c6 with very good play. And of course, you just don't want to open up pressure on c6. So what we actually see is pawn to b4 from Aronian here, attacking this bishop on c3. I should mention that at this point, there was a potential bailout. Probably black is worse, but sometimes when your opponent sacrifices, you need to decide, I'm going to bail out now. I'll be a bit worse, but I think I can hold. The opportunity to try to do that here is bishop takes c5, giving the bishop for two pawns, and after queen takes c5 check, king over, notice that this is defended by the queen here, then pawn takes, bishop takes. Now, this is a position where black has two pawns for a rook. It's different than the position we looked at a moment ago because these pawns are certainly not very impressive here. There's ideas of bishop b4, and this pawn might fall here. But there are pretty good chances for counterplay for Aronian in this position, right? I definitely think white is better. I would much prefer to have two minor pieces versus the rook and two pawns here. But are we really sure that we have so much to target in the black position that we're going to be able to force some kind of win of material or totally winning advantage? And are we really sure here that we're never going to allow counterplay to the black heavy pieces as they try to get some kind of initiative going against the white king? I, for one, am not sure that that's the case. And I think that, again, although white is better here, there's reasonable chances for black in this position due to the complex nature of the game. However, Aronian did not feel like this was the time to try to bail out into a clearly worse position. Instead, after pawn to f3, he pushes forward with b4. He's going to keep his material advantage. The pawn captures on e4, gaining a tempo on the black queen, which moves back to e6. There's definitely some potential pressure here on the center. Bishop f6 is coming. For example, if bishop takes b4, then already black is doing well with bishop f6, trying to eliminate the knight, and the knight's not in a good position to move because this is in trouble. In this position, things do collapse for Topalov, so you have to watch out for something like this. So after queen e6, we see bishop b2, keeping the sturdy control of the middle of the board. That bishop is a critical defender of those central squares. The bishop still goes to f6, but in this position, we actually see that Aronian might have made a tactical error, although it's possible he saw what was coming and just didn't see a better option. Knight takes c6. Another boom, strong blow from Topalov. After knight takes c6, it is, of course, tremendously important that you're eliminating that one pawn that was trying to hold back your strong pawns in the middle of the board. After knight takes c6, queen takes c6, pawn e5, you're, of course, winning this bishop over here. The queen on c6 needs to move. Queen a6, e takes f6. And now it's time to bring a rook over to e8. Which rook should you bring? Actually, according to the computer, you should play the very unintuitive rook b to e8 so that you don't have a rook on b8, which is maybe hit by a bishop or maybe hit by a pawn later on. Of course, as a human, it is crazy, crazy difficult to imagine burying this rook here on f8, but maybe rook b to e8 was the superior option. In the game, though, it is the more natural rook f to e8 that's played, and then the queen goes to f1, offering a queen trade. Now, often when you sacrifice, you don't want to trade queens, but this is entirely different. If the queens are traded, it's going to be much harder for black to stop these pawns and to get some counterplay that could balance the game against the exposed white king. Black is willing to trade queens, but after queen e2 only if you bring my rook to the second rank in this position. Topalov's not going for that. He does have an attacked bishop on b2 though, so he plays queen f2, saying again, you can trade queens. They're both saying, hey, you can trade queens, but on my terms. And in this position, the point is that if you capture and the king comes up, the king is well placed on f2. There's no invasion on the second rank. And again, these pawns are starting to roll up the board. Now, queen f2, in addition to being a clever idea to try to get black to trade queens on white's terms, does sacrifice that pawn on g4. If we thought that the white king was exposed before, if we lose the pawn on g4, it's definitely in a much worse spot than it was a moment ago. In fact, I think this is a really great point to kind of pause the video and just assess this position, right? If we just take a step back, don't make any moves for a moment, and just look at this position, isn't black doing pretty well here? If this was your game, wouldn't you feel like you should be doing well with the black pieces? I mean, you're up material, okay, sure, white has some connected passed pawns, but they aren't that far up the board yet. I have ideas like rook e2 for counterplay here. I have ideas like bishop e4. Your king on g1 definitely feels exposed. It's certainly a very, very tense moment, and if white did not follow up accurately here, then white could get into trouble, I think. However, after h3, this queen is tickled and has a difficult decision. Where does it go so as not to allow white to finish coordinating the pieces and really get these pawns rolling? In fact, I think that this is where Aronian makes the decisive mistake. In this critical position, he played queen to g5, which I think is close to losing the game. Instead, queen to h5 seems like the correct move. If you go queen to h5, then you have an idea of rook e2. Fairly straightforward idea. One of the points that might be missed of rook e2 is that in a lot of cases, you're going to sacrifice rook takes g2. And if you eliminate this light squared bishop, the white king is very open on the light squares to checks from the queen or to attacks like bishop e4. For example, if you just try and push forward with your pawns, like pawn to c6 here, then rook e2, the queen moves, attacking b8, and rook takes g2 allows enough counterplay for black in this position to draw the game. According to the computer, after queen f2, which defends this, then we're able to draw with both bishop e4 or queen to e4. Sufficient counterplay if we can give back the exchange to make the light squares vulnerable. Same kind of thing if instead after queen h5 you push forward with d5. This is even better for black because rook e2 and queen f4. And now when you sack, you even eliminate the pawn on d5, although according to the computer, this is still just equal, but it's starting to feel like it could be white that could easily lose this game with the exposed king. So we do have one other idea that I want to look at. Say after queen h5, you try and stop rook e2 with rook e1. Now you can go queen to g5. And what's surprising is after queen g5, you've got the queen on the same square that it was on in the game. And it should be even better for white, right? Because we brought the rook over to e1. But in this version, after the move bishop c1 as played in the game, black is able to capture on f6 and actually get a very reasonable position. White has not managed to launch these pawns up the board here, and there's a likely exchange of rooks here that is going to be sufficient for counterplay. Notice that queen takes f6 allows rook takes e1, and black is doing fine in the resulting position. Instead of that, after h3, we did see queen g5 right away instead of queen h5 and then zigging over here after that rook e1 idea. So after the immediate queen g5, the problem is bishop to c1 in this position, rerouting to f4. Obviously, the bishop is going to be better on f4 than it is on b2, where it's totally blocked and performing a very defensive role in the middle of the board. What about queen takes f6 here? Well, maybe you should even go for this, but after queen takes f6, queen takes, g takes, there's not going to be an exchange of rooks. And so after, for example, bishop f4, white's pawns are better prepared to move up the board if there's not going to be an exchange of one pair of rooks. We can support and get these guys going very, very well supported by the bishops. We feel much better about the potential of these pawns to move up the board here, with black trying to hold it back with two rooks. The two rooks hate to be trying to defend from the front of past pawns. So super complex stuff, but ultimately after bishop c1, this position's starting to look close to a win for white. Now the queen goes over to h5. We have that idea of rook e2, but in this position, bishop f4 comes. You cannot go rook e2 in this position, or it's not a good idea because of queen g3. You're not in a position to sacrifice back here, and you're getting hit over here. There's also ideas sometimes of queen g4, potentially. So after bishop f4, we have rook b to d8, trying to move over and keep an attack here on this critical d pawn. After rook b d8, that c6 pawn is already moving up the board, pawn c5 forward to c6 here, and bishop e4 c7, hitting that rook with a gain of time. The rook goes over to c8, and now rook to e1. Now, in this position, it's not clear to me that this game can actually be saved for Aronian, but the move he played definitely loses the game on the spot, thanks only to an excellent idea from Topalov, of course. Now, after rook e1, we should mention what could have happened if bishop takes g2. After bishop takes g2, we can trade rooks here and then play queen takes g2. Notice that we're threatening mate over here. Queen takes g7 is a mate threat. And if you play pawn to g6, we're going to play queen g4. We're simply going to trade queens, and then the pawns just march. There's no defense for Aronian in this position, right? It's interesting that trading queens is an important part of white's play in a lot of these positions, right? After queen takes g2, you can also see one check here, queen d1, but after king h2, there's definitely no time for this because we've got mate here. We've also got mate threatened here. And if we play pawn to g6, then again, we can break through with white. The idea is queen to e4, which is actually, great move and the only move in the position that wins. Here, you can't take, of course, because we're going to promote and we're going to back rank mate you. And this queen is perfectly covering, along with the bishop, all of the potential checks against this king over here. So you can't play, for example, king f8 because, well, actually I have a bunch of things. I can throw checks for the bishop on either square and then take, or I can play queen takes e8 and then make a queen, and that's even mate. And if after we play this great queen e4 move, you try to move over passively with rook c8, we can just start pushing our pawns. You don't have enough counterplay here. We can easily blockade things, and these guys are rolling, winning position for white. So we've shown that a move like bishop takes g2 was not going to hold in this position. What did black actually play? In fact, in this position, Aronian plays queen g6, putting pressure here on this pinned bishop. And now, if you just play something simple, then actually black is still doing okay in this position. You're looking at potentially exchanging the bishop. You're looking at maybe winning this. You have ideas like rook e6. There are ideas for black here, but after the move rook takes e4, boom again, another great move. We sacrifice a second exchange to just launch the pawns up the board. After this, the game is totally winning. There's no more hope for Aronian, and we can actually kind of play on autopilot. Rook takes e4, rook takes e4, and then just d5. We're only a few moves away from getting two connected pass pawns on the 7th rank, promoting a pawn, and even probably mating the opponent's king here on the back rank. Rook c over to e8, pawn to d6, rook e1 check, king h2, queen f5, desperately hoping for counterplay, but queen g3, threatening mate right here. There are many ways to win at this point in the game. And now another example of trying to trade the queens to finish things off. Queen g5. We've even got ideas of mating like this, so there's no good way to avoid the queen trade, but after the queen trade, you're also not stopping these pawns. Rook to d1, bishop to c6, hitting this. There are a few checks for the black rooks, but after king g3, we did see Aronian resign this game. You can give just one more rook check, maybe two more rook checks, I guess, and then you're going to be faced with a situation where you've got a rook hanging, you're also faced with mate, and there's nothing left to do. So we did get the resignation in this position after 44, king to g3. I hope that you enjoyed this game. It's really a wonderful effort from Topalov. If you want to see more of the top 10 games of the 2000s, you can click on the playlist on top of the chessboard, and you can also check out the playlist with the top 10 games of the 2010s.